On the Bronze Age steppe, over 4,000 years ago, the people of the prehistoric Catacomb culture built a huge, mysterious structure atop a high ridge above a river flowing south towards the Black Sea. Archeologists have called this structure a temple or a sanctuary because of its processional roads, stone stela, and its central raised altar. The societies of the Eurasian steppe during the Bronze Age are famous for their earthen barrows. There were thousands of these burial mounds built from the late Neolithic onwards by a succession of related cultures. Also known as kurgans, these structures of earth, clay and stone were erected over burials of special people. These burials are so important in understanding these cultures that archaeologists named them after the specific types of graves they made. The Catacomb culture emerged after about 2500 BC from the earlier Yamnaya or pit grave culture. They built thousands of barrows over thousands of burials, but at this one special site, about 40 kilometers north of the Sea of Azov, they also constructed this strange, unique structure, and perhaps a network of similar sites. So what was this place? How did it change over time? What rituals might it have been used for? What god might they have worshipped here? And what can it tell us about the Catacomb culture and their religious beliefs and practices? This is the story of the mysterious temple mounds of the Bronze Age steppe. The site itself is about 40 kilometers north of the city of Melitopol and near the town of Molochansk, beside the Molochna river which flows into the Sea of Azov. Initially, it appeared to be an enormous mound of earth on a high plateau on the bank of the Molochna river. This was the highest point along the ridge, and the top of the mound was 80 meters above the floodplain below. The mound itself was 100 meters in diameter. The site only revealed its true character through extensive archaeological excavation. It took this extensive destructive excavation in 1982 to discover that this was no ordinary burial mound. There was a long and complex history of the site, evolving over the centuries it was in use. It likely dated from about 2500 BC, although the precise dating isn't clear. There were multiple mounds clustered together at the site, and they excavated 49 burials here from the late Yamnaya to the Catacomb culture era. They also discovered a previous archaeological excavation from the early 20th century where a massive rectangular section of the mound had been removed, obliterating whatever had been there before. Anyway, the real surprise was that at the centre of the complex was a strange and unique ritual structure. Not a burial mound, although it had later burials inserted into it, but some kind of elevated platform with a central altar and ramps leading up to it. And there had in fact been at least 3 stages of construction and use. Peeling back the layers of turf and soil, they found that the earliest phase here was when Catacomb culture builders constructed 13 steep, radial, irregular embankments out of large clay blocks, forming a central circular platform about 20 meters in diameter. There were slopes between the embankments, forming steep paths up to the centre. The surfaces of these slopes were compacted from people walking on them. There also happened to be 13 radial straight roads leading away from the site for between 1200 metres and 4500 metres. They determined this through aerial photography. And you can even see a few remnants on Google Maps today. Some researchers believe these lines were of an astronomical nature, relating to positions of constellations. Others think they're purely economic and are evidence of ancient trade routes, where generations of caravans left their mark in the ground. Or they could be the routes of approach by 13 different surrounding tribes, coming to this point for the annual ritual here. I'll talk more about these roads later. This first stage with the 13 steep embankments and flat top had a raised rectangular altar in the centre, again made of large clay blocks. This altar was surrounded on 3 sides by a path about 5 meters wide, covered crosswise with a bed of reeds. In the rotten reeds they found fragments of animal bones, which perhaps means animal sacrifices, ritual consumption or offerings took place up here. It seemed likely people used the many slopes to access the top and then processed around the altar and whatever was happening before it and upon it. The second phase of development saw those gaps, the slopes up between the bays, filled in with earth blocks, and they built new routes up to the top. There were now 2 ramps up, one on the west and one on the east, and both these ramps had 2 approaches, one from the north and one from the south. The ramp surfaces were laid with large flat stones, then covered with crushed limestone gravel and then clay on top, and they used large flat slabs to make stepped layers around the base of the ramps and foundations beneath. They also included limestone stela on the approaches. Limestone stela had long been used on the steppe by the Yamnaya culture in funeral contexts, perhaps set up as temporary grave markers before being used as grave covers in burials, and rarely they could be carved with more details. At this site, there were stelae erected that the excavators describe as anthropomorphic or human-shaped, and one they describe as being in the form of an axe. The southern approach road was 8 metres wide and 44 metres long, and it was constructed by many very thin layers of clay and black soil. The researchers believed that every year the site was in use, the surface of the road was covered with a new thin layer of clay before the rites. Then through the rest of the year, a thin layer of the naturally occurring local black soil accumulated through wind and erosion over the surface, and so causing these alternating layers to build up over time. Counting the layers leads them to conclude that this phase of use lasted for 30 or 40 years before the final stage was constructed. This third and final phase saw all the ramps filled in and the mound expanded in size. There was now just a single wide ramp up to the top, in the east about 10 metres wide. They also laid a broad layer of ash, burnt stones and bones on the top of the mound, which they then buried beneath layers of soil. The burning itself was not carried out here, but somewhere else, and the remains of that fire was brought up to the top to be spread out and deposited. This was a significant effort, and was perhaps related to the ritual closing of the previous form of the sanctuary. After this point, there were multiple burials inserted into the barrow, and the whole complex was ultimately covered too, so the site looked like one huge, roughly circular mound. It's worth thinking about barrows more broadly for a moment. Different cultures throughout history have developed the urge to erect monumental structures for various reasons. Those that survived best until today were built in stone, whether in Atlantic Neolithic Europe, or the Bronze Age Aegean and the Near East, or in ancient Central America. They used the best building materials they had to hand. Other places, like on the North European plain, built their grand structures from their most readily available material, enormous tree trunks. Sadly, these mighty timber structures decomposed over the millennia, leaving only faint traces in the soil. Other societies, for example in Mesopotamia, had few trees or stone, and so used the wonderful clay they had, baked into hard blocks by the hot Middle Eastern sun. On the Eurasian steppe, again both trees and stone were rare commodities. They preferred to use the wood they had for fuel and for building incredible wagons. Limestone slabs, where available, were also considered special and were used as grave markers and grave covers for certain important people. But when they wanted to build monumentally, they had to use the only material they had in great abundance, the earth. If you wanted to build something high and imposing on the landscape, this was the only way to do it. And people here built thousands upon thousands of burial mounds for centuries, and although they were erected over the graves of important people, they were not just grave markers. They were also sacred sites that people returned to for commemorating and communing with their ancestors. For the Middle Bronze Age Catacomb culture, the layouts of a group of barrows and the arrangements of the graves beneath them are thought to reflect the layouts of the real-life wagon camps of the people who built them. They were, in a way, houses for the dead to reside in for eternity, and a physical imposition on the real world for these mobile herders to periodically return to. They were the only places of real permanence for society regularly on the move within their ancestral home ranges. So it makes sense that this special ritual site was built with earth, clay and stone, and in the form, ultimately, of a great mound. So how was this site used? What can it tell us about the catacomb culture? Are there any more sites like this? And how might it be related to the incredible stone tomb complex nearby? Just 20 kilometres to the south is a site known as the Stone Tomb Complex, which was used as a ritual site by multiple cultures for thousands of years, at least from the Mesolithic to the Middle Ages. This is a natural rock formation that has attracted special attention in every era by the peoples who lived here. There are natural caves and man-made caves within, where the walls are covered with carvings. Some researchers even argue there are carvings of mammoths here, meaning it was in use in the Paleolithic. There's lots to talk about with this site, so please let me know in the comments below if you're interested in seeing a full video about the Stone Tomb Complex. Anyway, this is a natural mound formed from limestone slabs. At one point it was an island in the middle of the river, and you have to wonder if it informed the design of the structure 20 kilometres away to the north along the river. We don't know if or how the ritual activity here in the Bronze Age was related to the other site, but it does rather suggest that this small region as a whole was religiously significant. There were also many large burial mounds in the area, and the ritual site itself included multiple catacomb culture burials featuring the upper elites of the Ingul subgroup. Archeologists subdivide the catacomb culture into regional variants, and the Ingul, named after the river at the heart of the territory, was the subgroup that created death masks from clay and resin for some of the special people they buried. This is a practice that perhaps reveals something of the catacomb culture burial tradition. Catacomb culture burials reveal complex beliefs to do with the afterworld as a kind of extension or reflection of the living world. The size, depth, orientation and positions of burials, as well as the grave goods, also reflect the social status and even the occupation of the individual being buried. Grave goods can include tools or weapons the person might have used in life, like the stone mace or axe of a leading chief, or the metalworking tools of a bronzesmith, or in some cases the materials thought to be used by priests. Some archaeologists prefer to use less loaded terms like ritual specialists, but these kinds of burials show there was a social class in these societies of people who facilitated the ritual activities. Those with the expertise for leading sacrifices, coming-of-age rituals, mortuary rites, and presumably the administration of whatever went on here at the Molochna temple mound. This elite class profession is identified in several ways, but often through grave goods related to ritualized activities, like tattooing tools or the pestle and mortars used for preparing ritual substances, and the materials used for preparing clay or resin death masks, and the pigments like red ochre used for painting them. Anyway, so what rituals might catacomb culture priests have led at this specific site? Well, unfortunately, it's very hard to say. The excavator's report suggests that because of what they described as an axe-shaped stela, the site could have been dedicated to the steppe thunderer striker god known as Perquanos in the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European language, and later worshipped as Thor by the Norse, Perun by the Slavs, and by many other names by many other Indo-European societies. Known by his stone weapon, he was also associated with lightning, oak trees, and mountains, and as the figure whose defeat of a mighty serpent frees the waters and brings the rains. Perhaps the elevated position above a river valley lends weight to this interpretation of the site, but it seems like a bit of a reach to me. They also draw comparisons to records of the Hittite spring festival called Antashum, which involves the king praying and pouring libations to an upper and lower stela. And it seems the Catacomb Temple Mound was used annually, if the interpretation of the regular renewal of the approach road is correct. However, the annual rites could have taken place at any time of the year, and so not be related to spring at all. And the Indo-European societies ancestral to both the Catacomb and the Hittites had diverged many centuries earlier, and the Hittite ritual was recorded centuries after this site had gone out of use. So this interpretation seems little more than speculation to me. Lastly, the report draws parallels in the mound structure with its stepped sides and sloped approaches with Mesopotamian ziggurats. But again though, there's no obvious connections between these societies, so I don't see why they mention it. What we do know is that the site was important because of the amount of effort they put into its creation, its regular use, and periodic reconstruction. Its importance is also shown by the many high-status burials dug into it, one of which is the largest Ingul catacomb burial chamber known. On the one hand, this site is unique. However, there are other mounds from this era that were constructed across the region north of the Black Sea, likely for ritual purposes. Using what was discovered at Molochna, especially the radiating roads, researchers have looked for other possible sites in surveys matching the key external features. This survey found a possible 46 mounds that formed an arc along the Ingul River, crossing the Dnieper, the north of Crimea, and up the Molochna River. These mounds, with flat tops and no central burials, had between 3 and over 9 radial roads. Journeying and processions can be important parts of rituals, but it seems possible the roads were the final sections of routes that surrounding groups used to travel to and from the sites. Another interesting point is that most of the identified sites would have been within sight of 2 or more of the others. Considering the way they arc across the landscape from the heartland of the Ingul River to the cultural boundaries of the Donetsk group in the east, I wonder if they served as territorial markers, as Barrows also surely did, and perhaps even as signal towers. Maybe I'm getting carried away, but it does suggest a more sophisticated and well-organised society than we might expect from Middle Bronze Age steppe herders. It's possible, of course, that there were more sites, like this temple and the other mounds, that were destroyed before being recorded and excavated. In the early 20th century, archaeologists undertook the first surveys of the Barrows across the steppes. This work was interrupted by war, revolution, and more war, but most destructive of all was Soviet collectivization and industrialized farming practices. Countless thousands of steppe barrows were intentionally destroyed by harvesting them for their rich black earth, or were ploughed flat to extend farmland, or were otherwise destroyed to make way for mining or building. An estimated 75% of all barrows on the steppe were lost between first being recorded in the early 20th century and the later surveys at the end of the 20th century. They had survived for thousands of years up to that point, but if it wasn't for those early surveys, we wouldn't even know they had been there in the first place. So we're very fortunate that this sanctuary site survived long enough to be excavated. In fact, it was right beside, just 150 metres away, from a Soviet-era collective farm that was also built on the highest point of the ridge. Before the temple, the site might have been special to the Yamnaya culture, who buried some people here and erected small mounds. Then their Catacomb culture descendants built this sanctuary and used it for annual rituals for the elite classes, likely involving processions and facilitated by priests. You wonder if these rites involved honouring the ancestors or worshipping the gods, or both. Perhaps the elevated position involved observations of the sun, moon or stars. Maybe the shapes of the temple mound replicated the shape of the ancient stone tomb complex to the south, or somehow reflected the dome of the sky above. And the changes in design of the site through the various phases could reflect changes in belief systems or innovations in ritual practices. As for who and how they worshipped here, I wonder if any clues could be found in the shrines and sanctuaries of the Mycenaeans, who likely descend in part from these Western catacomb culture people. Maybe there could be distant reflections seen in later Greek festivals or mythology. Either way, this incredible site ignited my imagination and sense of wonder. You can almost picture the scenes here over 4,000 years ago of great blocks of clay being lifted into position by gangs of workers, and baskets of earth being dug and shifted, sandstone slabs being dragged here and erected, overseen by priests and chiefs. Then later, the processions approaching from all directions and climbing the ramps, the priests standing by the altars, perhaps with their hands raised to the Sky Father as the sun rises, or perhaps the scene was lit by fires in the dark of the night. And generations later, the most formidable chief these people had known was honoured by being buried in the heart of this great temple of his ancestors. The excavators suggest this level of social organisation, as well as other evidence, implies this was a state or proto-state level society. I wouldn't say that necessarily follows, but it does tell us this was a more sophisticated and more organised society than we might once have imagined. Most regular viewers of my channel are not in fact subscribed, so if you like my videos, please do subscribe to ensure you see more of them, and it really helps me out too. I must say a huge thank you to my patrons and channel members. By supporting the channel, you get exclusive content and ad-free videos, and it helps me access high quality footage and expensive academic sources. The links to join us are in the description below. Please do so if you can. Now please watch this video that will tell you all about the fascinating catacomb culture of the Bronze Age steppe. Thank you for watching.